Welcome to episode 2. Last week we talked about the glute medius and the glute maximus. This week we're going to talk about the Booty Trilogy. What is the Booty Trilogy? The spine, the pelvis and the hips. When we get these 3 correct, you will get optimal glute recruitment. It's something rarely talked about in fitness circles, and we're going to take you through, just like last week, a bit of the anatomy, and then we're going to explain it very simply. And the other side benefit of getting these 3 things correct, besides from building great glutes, will be injury prevention, primarily for the spine, because as we know, if we get injured, we can't train at all. So there's only one formula we need to know that will then make sense for this presentation. Good old Newtonian physics. Don't get lost here. It's very simple. Power is mass times acceleration. So in terms of weightlifting, mass is the weight on the bar and acceleration is the movement of a joint. So we want to have high power output coming from our hips, which is glute max. And there's just one rule we need to know, that the muscle length dictates how much torque or power we can produce. So when a muscle is on stretch, like your biceps are on stretch, it doesn't have much torque. It can't produce as much power at the joint as when it's in its mid position. When it's in its mid position, it's most powerful. And when it's at its most contracted position, yes, it's highly activated, but it cannot produce any more power or movement at the joint. So we must keep this in mind for when we go through our Booty Trilogy. So keep that in mind, and we're going to cross over to the PowerPoint. Okay, so the Booty Trilogy, hips, pelvis and spine. First thing we need to know is that everyone has an individual type of hip. First, here we see femoral anteversion. All that means is pigeon-toed. Basically, the natural alignment of the hip predisposes them to having a turned-in foot. And if they tried to externally rotate, so go from this position out, you would see that the bone hits the bone, but they have a good tendency to be able to turn in. So just for this one singular fact, these people could never really do too much of a toe out position, as it wouldn't be conducive to their hip anatomy, and it would cause their hips to hit end of range and likely butt wink. They will likely never do a sumo or wide stance to try and activate their glutes. They will still need to produce hip torque like we talked about last week and keep their knees tracking over their toes. And these people tend to have a need to do a little bit more direct glute work. Not always, it depends on their lever lengths as well, but most of the time the turned in position makes it a little harder for the glutes to fire, simply because they're on a little bit more of a stretch position. So as we just learned, means it's harder for them to fire up. The next type of hip at the other end of the spectrum is retroversion, i.e. the duck-footed people. So as you can see here, the difference is the ball sits way back in the socket and they have a natural tendency to turn out due to their alignment. If they try to turn in, the front of the socket would hit the rim and they would run out of range by trying to turn their toes in. So if you have this type of hip, usually you need a small degree of toe out positions on your squats and possibly deadlifts. They're usually better at wider stance movements. So things like even semi-sumo or sumo deadlifts may work very well for them, for their glutes. On their hip thrust, they need to put their toes out a little bit as well to get their optimal glute recruitment. And these people in general, again depending on levers, tend to build their glutes a little easier. So after this PowerPoint, I'm going to show you how to test your own hips to determine what type of hip you have and how that will play a role in getting the right alignment for your glutes to fire. So now we move up to the pelvis. The pelvic position plays a huge role in getting your glutes to fire. So as you can see here, which is most common, if your hips are tilted forward for whatever reason, and especially during lifting, you will end up with tight lower back, tight hip flexors, and usually ITBs. And you can see that the glutes are put onto a stretch position, which again, as we learned, it makes it hard for the glutes to fire. The second is too much posterior pelvic tilt, i.e. flat bum syndrome. Having it too flat will tighten up your hamstrings, tighten up your abdominals, and now the glutes are in too much of a contracted position to produce as much force as they could. So again, you don't get optimal glute recruitment. And either of these are very good at all for protecting the back, which I will show you later. That is the injury prevention side. So in summary, if your hips tilt forward whilst you're lifting, you will get poor glute recruitment, tight hip flexors, and a lot of pressure on your lumbar and sacral joints. If it rolls too far back, again, you'll get poor glute recruitment, but you risk lumbar disc injury, which is a big one. So neutral pelvis is ideal for recruitment, balance, and the reduction of injury risk. And I'm going to show you a very simple demonstration soon to show you that. Now we move on. Just before we move on to the spine, we move on to the glute killer. This is the most common issue. The anterior pelvic tilt is coupled with internal rotation of your legs. So if that happens, of course, now you have the exact opposite environment for what you want for your glutes to fire. Your glutes need to be externally rotating your legs and have a neutral pelvis. So if you're doing anything with an anterior pelvic tilt whilst lifting, not only do you not recruit your glutes as well, you are risking injury to your lower back. And of course, like we said last week, when your knees come in on squats and deads, it is rarely a function of weak hip stabilizers. It is usually a lack of alignment because your glute max is not firing and externally rotating your knees. So we come back to that point again. And just as a side note, when your knees come in on a squat at about that 90-degree knee bend, most of the fibers of glute medius are orientated to actually flex and internally rotate your leg. The exact opposite of what we're trying to achieve with keeping knees out over toes. Again, just another point to show it's about spinal alignment and glute max to keep those knees tracking where they should and get your optimal glute recruitment during the big lifts. So now we move on to the spine. We want to maintain a neutral spine as well. If we arch too much during our lifting, we put a lot of pressure on what are called the facet joints or the sacral joint down here. You can get joint lockups, back pain, back spasm, and of course SIJ or pelvis issues. Poor core strength, that's the abs pushing from the front here, can also be a contributing factor, especially in the lumbar spine, but it's must be coupled with that holding the pelvis in neutral with your glutes. So we don't want to have an arch when we're lifting. We want to hold a neutral spine. And here is probably the most common thing we see with squatting, we'll say, and a very common injury in the general population and also in the gym, is butt wink. Butt wink is where you get to the bottom of a squat position, even on the leg press, and your pelvis rolls under. It butt winks. This can occur due to tight hips as well, but more commonly it's actually caused by an incorrect stance versus the hip anatomy we just went through. So if you get that correct, a lot of the time you can correct butt wink straight away. And I'm going to show you how to do that practically. And the other way you can get spinal flexion is rounding your back on a deadlift. Everyone knows this. You do not want to lift the bar off the floor and round your back. It will create this same issue. And this I'm going to show you dynamically in a second. But if you put your discs under compression and then move into flexion, the pressure pops the disc straight out the back. Now that could happen after 3 weeks, 3 months, 3 years. Depends on your genetic strength in your discs. But if you do it repetitively, you can nearly guarantee at some stage you are going to bulge your disc. So that's why another reason we're pedantic on holding a neutral. Okay, here we have the model. 2 vertebrae, top and bottom. We want to keep our spine neutral, which is exactly as it looks like here. A little bit of compression is fine. You can see the disc deforms, that's its job. If you extend too far backwards, the disc isn't going to bulge, but you are going to put a lot of pressure on this joint. It is going to jam down. And if this was the last joint of the spine, here's the pelvis, this joint is going to jam. So that's why we don't want to extend too far whilst we're lifting. But the worst one, of course, is when we are under load, so we are slightly compressed, and now we move into flexion, which is with butt wink or spinal flexion, and we go too far, boof, out comes the disc bulge, and that yellow thing is your nerve root, aka sciatic pain, numbness, and power loss down the leg. So what we want to gain is just simple neutral spine so it can do its job. No compression with flexion, bye-bye disc, or extension, bye-bye joints. Here we have Casey, one of our figure models. I'm going to show you how to assess your own hips to know whether your ball and socket is retroverted or duck-footed or internally rotated, so we know how to choose the right foot position. And so all we do is lay on our tummy. And if you've got a training partner, it's easy to do this. Just push down on the sacrum so it stays dead flat. Lift one leg up, and then you just let it go in until you feel resistance. So you can see Casey only goes in a little bit, so only about 20 degrees. And then this way is internal rotation. So she goes out much more. So she internally rotates to about 60 degrees and externally rotates only to 20. So she's actually more towards being pigeon-toed than duck-footed. So if we test the other hip, it should be similar. So yep, you can see I've got to push that down. She only gets to about there, and then she goes out quite easily. So she's quite duck-footed. So that pigeon-toed. So that tells us her choices of stance should be reasonably narrow with a little bit of toe placement, but she would never want to go really wide because it would hurt her hips. And the second thing to check, just to make sure you're not tight in the hips, is lay onto your back. This is mostly just for squatting, is you want to feel the loosest position in the hip when you're squatting. So all we do is go straight up and out to the side. And so we get to a point where, so it's a little bit of resistance there, about there. She can go her furthest into hip flexion. If we come out this way, it starts to pull back out of hip flexion. So she's her best about there. So that gives us an idea of how wide she should stand, and that her hips aren't too tight. So that's not too bad. And just to show you the difference, standing up very quickly, jump up. On myself, I am the exact opposite to Casey. I'll just show you on one leg I can hold my pelvis down. So for me, I can go inwards very easily with keeping my pelvis flat. Casey could only get to there. So I am very externally rotated or duck-footed. So for me, that's it. I can't go out any further, whereas Casey got to about there. So you can see our hips are very different. Hence, our choice of foot stance will be very different, which is what I'm going to go through next. Okay, so let's put it all together again like we did in episode 1. First, let's talk hips. First, you've got to ask yourself, am I anteverted or pigeon-toed? Am I somewhere in the middle, or am I retroverted or duck-footed? If you test yourself and you find yourself pigeon-toed, on your squat variations and your leg press variations, hack squats, you would choose a closer stance, toes mostly forward, maybe the tiniest bit out. The best deadlift variation for you would be the RDL and, of course, conventional deadlift. And you possibly would need some extra isolation work depending on your levers as well, which we'll go through episode 3. So that's the first test. Second is, if you found you were somewhere in the middle, you should choose more a moderate shoulder width stance. Toes turned out a little bit. I like to call it 11 and 1 on the clock face. Your best deadlift choices would be RDL again, or maybe even semi-sumo. You'll find you can get your glutes into that quite well, and you may find you need a bit of isolation work on your glutes to get the job done. Now, if you're duck-footed, what you'd find is probably a slightly wider stance on squats and leg press. Toes turned out a little more again. The RDL across the board, good for everyone, but you might well find the sumo deadlift great for activating your glutes. And if your leverages are optimal, quite possibly no need for isolation. These are the people that tend to just squat and build a bum regardless. So that's how you test yourself for your hips. For your pelvis, everyone must maintain neutral. And how do we do that? Like we told you in episode 1, you must torque your hips, turns the glute max on, pulls the pelvis into neutral. And finally, the spine should be neutral for everybody. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean straight. Some people are quite curved in their lower back. Some are a little straighter. That's genetic. But what we mean is that you are actively holding a neutral position, not pushing into extension or rounding into flexion for you. And the absolute golden rule when you're lifting is do not break back angle. The way you start the lift with your back is the way you should end it. It should not fold or move in any way. Now, I'm going to put all these together in a practical demonstration with our no-name model. Okay, first, our no-name model, who also talks, is going to demonstrate what we mean by neutral spine, neutral pelvis. This is him standing relaxed. You can see he has a natural arch in his back, and he is standing just normally with his arms forward so you can see his spine. Now, to hold neutral before a lift is only 2 things: the torquing of the hips, torque the hips, draw the belly in. You can now see that there is less of an arch and he is actively holding neutral. Glutes are on, and now he is ready to lift. That is universal for everybody. Torque the hips, brace the core, holding neutral spine. Now I'm going to demonstrate the difference of breaking back angle. So, even a lot of people say on an RDL will start not in neutral, they'll start arched. Already the glutes are off, they're not working too well. And they'll come down into an RDL, and as they come up, because they're not holding neutral, the back is doing a lot of the work in the hamstrings, and the glutes rarely get into the movement. As opposed to torque the hips, brace the core, hinge at the hip, and now the glutes have all the driving power to push into the movement. The next demonstration will show more so with squatting. Now, this no-name model that talks has duck feet. So, slightly wider stance, toes out. Same rules. torque the hips, brace the core, neutral spine, and squat into neutral, keeping a neutral spine and driving the hips into it. Now, if you simply made one mistake and took a stance that a pigeon-toed or duck-footed person does, narrow stance, still torque the hips, brace, holding neutral, he goes down, but because his hips run out of range, he loses back angle, and there you see the butt wing, and bye-bye discs. And as he comes up, it will extend back, and there you can also jam joints. And that was from one mistake, simply choosing the wrong stance due to his hip anatomy. Back to the natural stance, where the hips go, a nice neutral spine. I'm back. So as you can see, if you get your hips, pelvis and spine correct with your individual anatomy, you will be able to maintain alignment, minimize risk, get your glutes into it a lot more, and get a lot more out of your squat variations and your deadlift variations. And next episode, we're actually going to look at how our lever lengths determine our exercise selection, and also our bar path to make our lifts the best they can be to develop our glutes. That's a topic for next week. And next week I should also have some exciting demonstrations by an IFBB pro and a natural Mr. World, just to show no matter how good you are, we can all get better when we apply some decent science. See you next time.